Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot laid flowers on his mother's grave. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind swept wild across the prairie, bending the brittle grass like waves on a golden sea. Somewhere in that lonely vastness, the sound of a harmonica drifted faintly carried on the air, mingling with the steady rhythm of hoofbeats pounding against the cracked, sunburned earth. Red dust rose in swirls along the trail, leading to a weathered ranch house forgotten by time. Up on the hill, in a desolate graveyard where the wind moaned through crumbling headstones, Jonah McGraw came to a halt. He bent down and saw a single wildflower still fresh laid carefully upon his mother's cold grave. In that instant, the world seemed to stop. Jonah's chest tightened, breath caught in his throat. Memories surged back like an old wound torn open. Who had placed it there? Here in the unforgiving West, where no one had spoken her name in years, who else could have remembered her but him? The man and the silence of the West. The wind swept across the high plains, rustling through dry grasses that stretched clear to the horizon. In the distance, the purple ridges of mountains stood still like ancient sentinels guarding the wild frontier. A red dirt road cut across the fields, dust rising in swirls each time a hoof struck the ground. At the end of that road stood a small ranch house. Its wooden walls had faded to silver with age, the porch sagged on one side, and the barn stood empty. Only an old horse remained, breath steaming white in the chill of morning. The man who lived there was Jonah McGraw, well past 40, with a sun-worn face and gray, clouded eyes that had seen too many seasons of loss. Once he had been a hired gun roaming through dusty towns across the West. But after his mother passed, and after a winter storm claimed his wife, Jonah chose to disappear into solitude. His days began the same, striking a match to light the fire, sweeping through an empty stable, then walking alone into the fields. He spoke little, hardly a word beyond what he shared with the old horse. In town, folks called him the strange recluse. But to Jonah, silence was the only wall strong enough to hold back the weight of loneliness. Frame by frame, you can feel it, that quiet sinking into every creak of wood, every whisper of wind. A man, a ranch, and memories that gnawed at him day by day. And now let me ask you this. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. The Man and the Buried Memories. The western night was so still it seemed to swallow every sound. Out on the high plain, the wind moaned through the cracks of old timber, creaking like whispers of the past. Inside the weathered cabin, a dim oil lamp threw a thin ribbon of light trembling against splintered walls. Jonah McGraw sat motionless at a scarred wooden table, shoulders bowed, his calloused hands resting on the surface. Before him lay a faded photograph in a crumbling frame, its edges warped, the wood nearly broken. In the wavering glow appeared the stern yet gentle face of a woman, his mother. The picture trembled in his grip as though one deep breath might shatter it to dust. Jonah's eyes were empty, yet behind them swelled an ocean of memory. He could almost smell the cornbread his mother used to bake on cold winter nights. He could feel her thin hand resting on his shoulder the first time he ever held a gun. And somewhere deep in the silence, he still heard her voice. Jonah, don't let your heart turn to stone. Outside, the wind rattled the barn door. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across his gaunt face. Every wrinkle was a trail of dust traveled, every scar a storm endured. He bowed his head, fingers closing around a weather-worn cowboy hat at his side. Then, without a word, without even a sigh, Jonah rose. His boots pressed heavy against the wooden floor as he stepped out into the night toward the hill where his mother lay buried. The red dirt road had long been forgotten. Weeds grew thick, swaying like a dry ocean under the push of the wind. With each step, the cracked earth crunched beneath his boots, echoing in the lonely dark. He remembered as a boy when his mother would lead him up that hill to watch the sunset. She always said, "Up high, the wind will carry the soul back to heaven." Those words, once distant, now returned with painful clarity, blurring his vision. Tonight the sky was strewn with stars, yet their light could not soften the weight of his solitude. Far off, lightning flashed across the horizon, stirring the memory of the sandstorm that once swept away his entire herd. Thunder rolled low, heavy, as if the earth itself groaned, and Jonah's steps faltered beneath its echo. As the small graveyard came into view, broken headstones leaned beneath the moonlight. The wind pressed the dead grass flat, scratching against his trousers. The air carried the scent of dry soil mixed with the ghost of old memories. Jonah stopped clutching his hat, his chest tightening. He stepped to the familiar mound untouched for years, worn down to stone and weeds. And yet to him, it remained the only sacred ground. He knelt, his trembling hand resting against the cold marker. Mother. The word rasped from his throat, falling into emptiness, and in that moment a sudden gust swept across the hill, forcing his eyes shut. When he opened them again, the past came rushing back, fierce and unstoppable, like the pounding of ghostly hoofbeats echoing through his mind. The night wind carried with it the echoes of the Old West. Jonah closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he heard sounds long buried, the crack of a whip cutting through the air, cattle bawling as they stampeded across the dry prairie, gunfire rolling like thunder over the grass. A memory stormed back like that sandstorm years ago. Jonah, still a young man, then spurred his horse through a cloud of red dust, trying to drive the herd back together after lightning split the sky. Behind him, his mother's voice rang out above the chaos. "Hold on to that saddle, Jonah." The vision dissolved into the darkness, but the ache remained. He had saved the herd that night, but he could not save his mother from the winter sickness that took her soon after. And every time the memory returned, it cut him open fresh like a gunshot tearing through the heart. Before her grave, Jonah's shoulders trembled. The moonlight traced the lines of his worn face, etched deep by loss. Since the day she passed, the only sounds here had been the wind and the silence, and it was that silence that had eaten at him year after year. The next morning, Jonah tugged the reins of his old horse and made his way into town. The wagon wheels groaned along the dusty red road. As he passed, folks looked up, eyes full of suspicion or maybe pity. Children whispered, "That's old McGraw, the man who lives alone on the hill." The grown folk only shook their heads. "A mad recluse, just a ghost among us." Jonah gave no reply. He stepped into the old saloon and ordered a whiskey. A stumbling piano tune filled the air from the corner, while outside the wind drove red dust across the street. And then he froze. Behind the counter on the wall hung a painting, a faded picture of a field filled with flowers. For a moment his heart tightened in his chest. The sight of those blossoms struck him like a bullet, reminding him of the single flower on the grave the night before. A flower that should not have been there. His hand trembled around the glass. Something, or someone, was pulling him back into the past, and he knew he could not hide in silence forever. By evening, the wind grew harsher, pushing dust across the road. Dark clouds gathered heavy on the horizon, warning of a storm. Jonah rode home, the echoes of memory weighing heavy in his chest. At his door he paused, staring toward the hill where the graveyard lay. A restless urge clawed at him. The storm could break at any moment, yet something deeper pulled him back, demanding that he face the pain, the memories, and the unanswered question that haunted him. Who had placed that flower? Jonah took up his hat, gripped it tight, and set out once more. The only companions he had were the wind, the clouds, and the ghosts of memory. But he knew this was the beginning of another journey, one that would shatter the silence that had bound him for so long. The hill was calling him like a whisper from the past that refused to fade. If you found a fresh flower on a grave that no one had visited in years, what would you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Part 2. The Flower on the Grave. The hill rose beneath a crescent moon, wild grass bending low under the lash of the wind, as if the small graveyard itself bowed before the darkness. Jonah McGraw climbed step by heavy step, his boots sinking into the dry earth. Each footprint pressed down beside broken lichen-stained stones, the resting place of the poor and forgotten. His mother lay among them. For years, when Jonah came to this spot, he found nothing but weeds, worn rock, and silence. But tonight, His eyes froze in place. There on the barren mound of earth lay a wildflower, still fresh. Its crimson petals burned against the gray as if someone had struck a flame in the night. Jonah stiffened. His hand reached out, trembling, brushing the dampness on its petals. Cold dew seeped into his fingertips and his chest tightened. Mother, who remembered you? The words broke from him like a lost child's plea. He dropped to his knees before the grave, his old cowboy hat falling to the dirt. The wind rose, driving brittle grass into the air, and in his mind the past roared back like thunder. He was young again, a summer long ago, dust clouds, rising cattle stampeding wild across the prairie, gunshots, cracking, whips snapping. He remembered the chaos, the storm of hooves and horns. And there she was, his mother, standing tall on the hill, frail but unshaken. She raised her arm, pointed steady through the storm, her voice ringing clear above it all. Jonah, don't panic. Look straight ahead and ride. That voice lived only in memory now, yet it struck him with raw force. The flower, that flash of red, felt like someone had spoken her name aloud, reminding him that memory never truly dies. Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow, steadying himself. His eyes swept the hill, and then he saw it. Beside his own boot prints lay something else. Impressions pressed deep into the dry soil. Not boots, not hooves. Each mark was broad, uneven, and nearly half again the size of a man's foot. Jonah's breath caught. In the West, by campfires and saloon whispers, folks told stories of a shadow in the woods taller than any man, striding like the wind. They called it Bigfoot. Jonah had never believed. Not once. Until now. His heart thundered as he stepped back. The wind hissed through broken stones like the sigh of the dead. And for the first time in years, Jonah felt he was not alone. The next morning, he guided his old horse down the dusty road into town. The boards creaked beneath its hooves as he rode past the saloon. Faces turned half curious, half wary. In the cafe, a pair of drunks muttered. Old McGraw went up to the graveyard again, heard strange noises out there last night, from deep in the woods. Jonah said nothing. He ordered black coffee, sat quietly. From the corner, Clara, the girl who worked there, set down her rag and looked his way. There was no ridicule in her eyes, only silence. Jonah thought of the flower, thought of the prince. His lips moved as if to speak, but no words came. Who would believe an old man claiming a giant had laid blossoms on a grave? His hand tightened around the cup, letting the heat steady the tremor in his chest. By afternoon, clouds gathered heavy, the wind turning sharp with the promise of storm. Jonah returned to the hill, knelt once more at his mother's grave. The red flower still stood trembling in the gusts. "Who brought you here, Mother?" he whispered. A question cast into the void, never expecting an answer. In that moment, Jonah felt the land itself holding a secret, something both terrifying and tender, a truth that could crush him or set him free. His rough hand rested on the cold stone, eyes closed. He knew then whatever force had left that flower, it would not let him rest. He would have to follow it. If you found a flower on a forgotten grave, would you see it as a blessing or a warning? Share your thoughts below. Part 3. Tracks in the Forest. The sun dipped low in the western sky, spilling gold across the dry prairie. Jonah lingered at the grave for a moment longer, then lifted his gaze to the strange footprints trailing down the red dirt path. They were massive, so large his own boot fit neatly inside them. The edges were sharp, pressed deep, which meant whoever or whatever had left them had passed not long ago. Jonah drew a steady breath, tugged his hat low. Behind him, his old horse whinnied softly, as if to warn him back, but Jonah's boots carried him forward. The wind hissed through thickets of dry cactus. Somewhere far across the plains, a lone gunshot cracked the silence, a hunter trying his luck perhaps. Still, the sound strung Jonah's nerves tight. The West was full of dangers, not only from bullets, but from things no man had yet explained. He crouched, following the prints like a man walking the thin line between the real and the imagined. The trail wound into the woods. Shadows thickened under the oaks, the air heavy, the world outside falling quiet. Mist seeped low across the ground, curling around the trunks until the forest looked like another world entirely. Jonah stopped. He listened. No hoofbeats, no voices, only the faint, ragged sound of breathing not his own. His heart pounded. His hand dropped to the worn grip of the revolver at his side. Years had passed since he'd drawn on a man, but the West had taught him this truth. Silence often came before danger. A twig snapped. Jonah spun. Through the mist, a massive shadow moved, slow, deliberate. Its form loomed larger than any man's broad shoulders, blotting out the pale wash of moonlight. Jonah held his breath. For the first time in years, he could not tell if he faced reality or a ghost summoned by memory. The wind roared through the trees, and in it Jonah heard echoes of long ago, of dust storms rising, cattle bawling, gunshots cracking to steady a panicked herd. He was young again, spurred forward while men shouted, doubting him, "That McGraw boy can't hold the line." But on the hill his mother's eyes had burned bright as a beacon, and because of that gaze he had not run. He had held the reins, endured until the storm broke. That memory pulsed through him now as he stood on the edge of this new storm. His hand tightened, and he pressed deeper into the mist, tracing the giant tracks. Branches scraped his coat, leaving long scratches. The old horse snorted nervously behind him. Still Jonah pressed on, and then, between two ancient trees, he saw it. The figure towered above the mist, still as stone. Its fur was coarse gray in the dim moonlight. One massive hand rested against the trunk, fingers thick and long as roots. Jonah froze. For a suspended moment, the creature did not charge, did not roar. It simply stood there, its dark gaze lifted toward the hill, as though guarding something sacred. Jonah's chest ached. He wanted to speak, but his throat locked tight. Then, in a heartbeat, the shadow turned. With heavy, muffled steps, it melted back into the fog. The earth thudded under its weight, and then silence, as if it had never been there at all. Jonah stood rooted, the mist cold against his skin, like the fingers of the past pressing into his flesh. Slowly, he crouched and touched the fresh imprint in the dirt. His chest burned, not just with fear, not just with wonder, but with something else. Something like reverence. If this truly was Bigfoot, why had it laid a flower on his mother's grave? A wild beast had done what men had long forgotten. Was it a warning, a sign, or some silent justice the wilderness had chosen to deliver? Jonah lifted his gaze, blurred with mist. A lifetime of mockery and suspicion had made him an outcast in town. But tonight even he doubted his own eyes. If you saw a giant figure vanish into the forest, would you follow it or turn back? Tell me in the comments. Part 4. The only one he could tell. Night settled over the western town, dust rising pale under the moon. Hoofbeats echoed down the red dirt street, scattered and uneven. From the saloon came the sharp crack of gunfire, tangled with the harsh laughter of drunks. Jonah McGraw drew his coat tighter, reined in his old horse, and stopped before a small cafe tucked along the road. It was nothing like the noisy saloon, only the faint glow of lamplight spilling through fogged glass, carrying with it the soft scent of cornbread drifting on the breeze. He stepped inside. The door groaned, and for an instant heads turned, familiar eyes fixed on him, half curious, half scornful. Old McGraw again. Spends his life on that hill, now he wanders down here. Jonah said nothing. He lowered his head and took a seat in the shadows. His figure stretched across the wooden floor, blending with the moan of the wind outside. From behind the counter, Clara appeared. She was barely 20, hair pulled back, her dark eyes steady. Folks whispered about her family, about a past twisted enough to leave a stain. But Jonah had never heard her complain, never seen her weep. What'll it be tonight? Clara's voice carried no mockery, no frost. Jonah lifted his eyes. In the warm light he saw something in her, something that mirrored his own silence. "Black coffee," he said softly. "And if there's cornbread left?" She nodded, returned, and set down a steaming cup with a plate beside it. No extra words, no needless stares. Jonah wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat soak in. To the town, he was a mad old fool. But not to her. At last, His voice broke the quiet, rough low from too many years unused. "Last night, I saw something." Clara didn't press. She only pulled a chair, sat across from him, and waited. Jonah spoke in fragments as though piecing together shards of memory: the grave on the hill, the red flower still fresh, the enormous tracks, and the shadow that vanished into the mist. His eyes drifted far, sinking into a truth even he struggled to believe. When he finished, he sighed, his rough hand trembling on the table. He braced for the familiar ridicule dismissal. But Clara was silent. Her gaze held his, not with contempt, but with wonder. And then something gentler. "Your eyes," she said quietly. "They're different tonight. Like a man who's seen something strong enough to keep him from being alone anymore." Jonah froze. It had been years since anyone looked at him and named what they saw. Outside, the wind howled down the street. Horses spooked and bolted shouts rose. 3 gunshots split the night. The cafe stirred in commotion, but at their corner table, Jonah and Clara sat still. Clara set her hand upon the table, close, not touching, but near enough that he felt her presence. Her voice was soft, deliberate. "My father once told me, there are beings in the woods, not monsters, but keepers of memory. Maybe what you saw was one of them." Jonah's breath caught. For so long he'd lived under the weight of disbelief. Yet here for the first time someone didn't deny him. Clara had planted a thought. Perhaps the silence was real. Perhaps it carried a message. Their eyes met, holding for a moment of rare stillness amid the chaos outside. When night thinned, Jonah rose and pulled on his battered hat. He nodded to Clara, and in his eyes flickered something fragile, something new, a spark of trust. She answered with the faintest smile, small but enough to carve deep into Jonah the sense that he was not entirely alone. Stepping out into the cold wind, Jonah felt dust whirl down the street, rising once more from the trail that led back to his ranch. Overhead, the sky paled with the promise of dawn, and in his heart, something had shifted. He whispered to himself, "If Mother were alive, she'd want me to share. If you carried a secret no one believed, who would you trust enough to share it with? Tell me in the comments." Part 5. The fire in his heart. Night draped itself across the west, the wind howling over the barren hill. The sky glittered with stars, yet their light was not enough to chase away the cold sinking deep into the bone. Jonah McGraw knelt by his mother's grave, his hands trembling as he coaxed a small fire to life. Sparks rose and swirled in the wind, dancing like restless memories. The flickering glow lit his weathered face, gray stubble catching in the light. He leaned back against the stones, silent. Of all the places on earth, this was the only ground where he still felt close to someone. From far across the plain came the crack of a rifle, one lonely shot fading into nothing. Out here, it could have been a hunter, or it could have been a warning. Either way, to Jonah, it was a reminder the world he lived in was never truly at peace. He closed his eyes, letting the fire warm him, letting the wind cradle his memories. He saw himself as a boy, barefoot in the grasslands under the burning summer sun. He and the other children played at gunfights with sticks, shouting bang bang until the cattle scattered and the grown men cursed them back toward town. And then came the storm. A sudden wall of red dust the sky swallowed whole, the town vanishing in a cloud of grit. Jonah had stood frozen in the doorway, shaking until his mother pulled him close. She wrapped her frail arms around him, shielding him as she shut the heavy door. In the dark, she whispered, "You're never alone. No matter the storm outside, you still have me." Now the fire before him felt like that same embrace, her hand still resting against his shoulder. Jonah's lips quivered, and at last the tears came. For years he had forgotten what it was to be held like that. The flames crackled, tossing sparks into the wind. Jonah watched them rise, and it felt as though he was sending off the words he had never dared to say. He bowed his head and whispered, "Mother, I've lived in silence so long. I thought if I endured it, the memories would stay buried. But when I saw that flower, I knew you were still here. I miss you." Each word fell slow, carved deep into the earth itself. The wind carried his hoarse voice across the dark, scattering it among the trees. In that moment, loneliness no longer felt like a pit, but a bridge. Jonah was not just speaking to the dirt beneath him, but to the heavens above. The small fire became a beacon, the only light binding him to the past. Deep in the night, when the flames burned brightest, he heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the woods. His heart staggered, then quickened. His hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip. He turned. There, in the haze between the trees, a massive shadow moved, broad shoulders taller than any man, slow and unyielding. The fire cast Jonah's trembling shadow across the stone, and for an instant he heard again the laughter of drunks, the mocking words of townsfolk McGraw, the old fools dreaming again. But this was no dream. Not anymore. The shadow was watching him. Jonah did not fire. He did not shout. Instead, he turned back to the flame, laid a calloused hand against the cold stone of the grave, and whispered, "Mother, if there's someone out there who still remembers you, then I am not alone." The words lifted something heavy from his chest. The silence that had bound him for years cracked open, and within him another fire was lit, not to warm the body, but to kindle the soul. The wind roared, feeding the flames until they flared high, spilling light across the hill. Jonah's eyes glistened as he stared into the dark. He knew then he had stepped across a threshold, from silence into hope. If you were sitting by a lonely grave with only the wind to hear you, what would you whisper? Share it in the comments. Part 6. A new flower appears. Dawn crept over the western sky, spilling a pale rose glow across the hill. Mist clung low, wrapping the graveyard in a fragile veil. Dew glistened on the dry blades of grass, sparkling like shards of glass. Jonah McGraw stirred after a long night by the grave. The fire had burned to ash, leaving only gray dust scattered on the ground. The morning wind cut cold against his skin, yet within him lingered the warmth of words he had whispered to the past. He pushed himself upright, tugging the brim of his weathered hat low. But then, his eyes froze. On the mound before him, where his mother lay, rested a fresh flower. Crimson wet with dew, its petals glowed as though it had been laid there only moments ago. Jonah's breath hitched. He remembered clearly last night he had cleared the soil bare with his own hands. Flowers could not bloom overnight in such barren earth. This was no accident of nature. It was left by someone or something. A shiver crawled down his spine. The second time. This was no illusion. Someone truly was watching him. Jonah knelt, his rough hand trembling as it brushed the bloom. Its softness, the chill of morning dew, so vivid, so alive, it struck through to his heart. He scanned the mist. Nothing but drifting fog, the sigh of wind through leaning stones, the brittle clatter of branches. And then he saw them. New footprints, massive and clear, pressed deep at the edge of the grave. Wet, fresh. His heart thundered. His hand hovered near the revolver at his side. Yet he did not draw. Deep down, Jonah knew whatever had come here bore no malice. It came for something men had long forgotten: remembrance. He swallowed hard and stood silent, letting the morning air wrap around him. Turning toward the prairie, he saw the horizon painted red by the rising sun. In the distance, the crack of a whip rang, sharp cattle-balled hooves thundered. The cowhands had begun their day. Then 3 shots split the air, rolling across the plain. That old sound, the call used to drive herds into line, pulled Jonah back through years. He saw himself once more astride a horse dust, thick the herd churning wild, the doubting stares of other riders cutting into him. McGraw will never hold the line. They had been wrong, yet he had let their doubt bury him in silence all these years. And now, another had remembered what he himself had nearly forgotten. Another had honored his mother. Was it nature's way of showing him that faith had not died? His vision blurred with tears. Jonah sank to his knees once more, laying a hand on the cold stone. His voice rasped into the wind. "Mother, it isn't only me who remembers you. Someone or something still keeps your memory. I don't know why, but I want to believe it's good." The wind rose, flattening the brittle grass. For a breath, Jonah felt as though the very earth agreed with him. The fire kindled in his heart the night before now burned brighter. Not just memory desire, a need to understand, to connect. The sun climbed higher, burning away the fog. Jonah remained at the grave, eyes fixed on the woods beyond. Somewhere out there, the creature might be watching him still. One question beat in his mind. Should he follow the tracks into the unknown or accept the gift of silence and guard the secret close? He settled his hat back onto his head, rising slow. His chest was filled with both unease and a strange, aching gratitude. For the first time in years, he knew he was not entirely alone. And so I ask you, listener, if you woke to find a fresh flower on a grave for the second time, would you chase the mystery or simply accept it? Tell me in the comments. Part 7. The Moment of Reckoning. The night sky glowed beneath a full moon, silver light spilling over the hilltop cemetery. Weeds bent low in the wind shadows of gravestones stretched long across the earth. No gunfire, no hoofbeats, only a silence so heavy it chilled the bone. Jonah McGraw sat with his back against the cold stone. His revolver stayed holstered, one rough hand resting lightly on the grip. He had kept vigil here night after night, waiting to prove to himself that the flowers had not been illusions, not tricks of wind or dream. The night air cut sharp as ice. Jonah tugged the brim of his hat, low eyes fixed on the black wall of forest. Deep inside him, fear and longing collided in restless waves. Midnight. The graveyard stilled. And then, thump, thump. Heavy footsteps rolled out of the trees. Branches cracked, mist swirled, stirred like a curtain parting. Jonah's hand tightened on the revolver. His heart hammered so hard it drowned his ears. He had lived through storms of cattle, through the thunder of gunfire on the open plain. But never, not once, had his body trembled like this. The moon cast its silver glow, and there it was. A shadow stepped into the clearing, taller than any man's shoulders, broad as a barn door, fur glinting gray in the light. The figure stopped before the grave Jonah knew too well. Jonah held his breath, and then something he could never have imagined. The giant shape slowly knelt, bowed its massive head, and from its enormous hands it laid down a bundle of wildflowers, red, yellow, violet, fresh from the deep woods. Jonah's world stilled. All the old tales of monsters of blood and terror turned to ash in that instant. What stood before him was no beast, but a being bent in reverence. His eyes burned and tears spilled down his cheeks. The image of his mother's smile flickered in memory, merging with this impossible sight beneath the moon. Jonah let go of the gun. His hand shook as he covered his face, overcome not by fear, but by grief and by awe. All his life he had endured the sneers, the laughter. McGraw, that old fool, lives with ghosts. Yet now, before his very eyes, a creature of legend had done what men themselves had forgotten, honored the dead. Something broke open inside him. Every wall of solitude crumbled. In the silence, he felt a thread binding him between his mother, between himself, and this being the world called a monster. The wind swept through, flattening the grass in a bow. The hill glowed under the silver light. The creature lingered, then rose. Its eyes caught the moon, a glint of recognition, and turned for a fleeting moment toward Jonah. Then, without a sound, it moved away, vanishing into the mist, its footsteps fading heavy and sure. Jonah dropped to his knees, pressed a hand to the cold stone, and whispered, "Mother, I am not alone anymore." The words carried into the wind, twining with the echo of those retreating steps. If you saw a creature everyone called a monster kneel down to honor the dead, would you still call it a monster? Tell me in the comments. Part 8. Whispers to the Wind. The moon hung high silver and full, washing the hilltop cemetery in its quiet light. The weeds bent low in the night breeze, and the dry thornbrush rattled as if the earth itself remembered. The wind carried the smell of dust and of memory. Jonah McGraw knelt at his mother's grave, his calloused hand pressed to the cold stone. His chest rose and fell as though he had fought a battle. Yet this was no fight of guns or storms. It was a war within, between doubt and belief, between pain and release. Far across the plains came a solitary gunshot, the echo chasing lowing cattle. The sound drifted back across the grasslands, blending with the sigh of the wind. Once such noise had left Jonah restless. Tonight, it felt like music. He whispered hoarsely, "Mother, I'm not alone anymore." The words broke rough, yet they lifted from him like a burden cast aside. Jonah leaned back into the grass, eyes fixed on a sky scattered with stars, and the flood of memory came. He saw his mother's smile, the way her thin hand brushed sweat from the brow of a barefoot boy. He saw her mending his coat before the winter storms. He saw her at the fence line watching as he rode out to drive the herd. For years, such visions had cut like blades, driving him deeper into silence, further from people. But tonight, beneath the wind, they came not as wounds, but as warmth, as arms, once more open to him. Jonah chuckled softly through his tears. All this time he had fled from memory, thinking it was a chain. But memory, he now understood, was a lantern burning against the dark. The wind rose, whipping grass into the air. Jonah sat upright, eyes turning toward the forest. The shadow of Bigfoot was gone, but its footprints still scarred the earth. And Jonah knew the truth. This was no monster. It was a being that remembered that honored things men themselves had long forgotten. He pressed his palm to his chest, feeling his heart steady. A lifetime he had borne the scorn of the town, the laughter of those who called him a fool. But tonight he knew, so long as one presence watched, he was not forsaken. The hill glowed under the moon's silver quilt. Jonah bowed his head, whispering again, "Mother, I won't let your memory be buried. I'll keep it, as that creature has kept it." The wind rushed by his ears, answering in its own way. Jonah nodded, a faint smile softening the face that life had carved so hard. In that instant, a silent vow was made, not with ink or iron, but with presence alone. And Jonah understood solitude had ended, not because someone had come, but because he had learned to admit love never disappears. The night passed on. Jonah rose, brushed the dust from his coat. The wind still blew, but it no longer chilled. It carried the sound of a beginning. At the crest of the hill, he turned, glancing back. The red flower on the grave still trembled in the breeze like a living flame. He tipped his hat, whispering one last time, "I am not alone." If you whispered into the wind tonight, what words would you send to someone you've lost? Share them in the comments. Part 9. The Secret of Memory. Silver moonlight washed across the hill. Jonah stood, frozen eyes locked on the towering shadow. Bigfoot had laid its flowers, and now it rose slowly to its full height. It turned, striding back toward the forest. Mist curled around its massive frame, as though the earth itself was swallowing it into its own hidden realm. Each footfall thudded deep like a drumbeat struck from the belly of the land. Jonah stood motionless, every beat echoing through his chest, reminding him this was no illusion. For years the town had looked on him with suspicion, even pity, but none of that mattered now. He had seen truth with his own eyes. When the figure vanished into the trees, Jonah stepped forward. The moon revealed the great impressions pressed into the damp soil. Each print was wide enough to swallow his whole hand, sunk so deep, only a creature of tremendous weight could leave it. Jonah knelt. His rough palm trembled as he pressed it against the cold earth inside one track. He felt the dampness, the depth, and knew his own hand was small, touching proof of a living legend. Tears welled not from fear, but from awe. He had spent a lifetime riding hard through stampedes, hearing rifles thunder across dust storms, enduring the scorn of men who mocked him as a fool. Yet this was different. These tracks, these marks in the soil were proof that his life had not been empty. A secret had been given to him, and it was his alone to bear. The wind swept across the hill, carrying echoes from the far prairie. Jonah closed his eyes, and in the rush, he heard it all again. The crack of a whip, the bawl of cattle, the crackling shots fired skyward to drive the herd. He saw the eyes of the cowboys, their doubts sharp as knives. "McGraw, you're not strong enough." But Jonah opened his eyes to the truth at his feet. No man's doubt could erase it. The ground itself bore witness. This was no monster. It was memory embodied, a guardian of what was sacred. Without a word, it had taught him what people had long forgotten, that love and remembrance never die. Jonah whispered, "I'll keep this secret, Mother, not just for myself, but for all who know that memory never leaves us." The wind bent the grass low as though the earth bowed in agreement. If a secret like this were placed in your hands, something no one else would ever believe, would you keep it or share it? Tell me in the comments. Part 10. Returning to the light. Dawn broke across the west, the first rays spilling over the prairie, melting the last veil of mist from the hilltop graves. Jonah McGraw descended slowly, boots heavy with damp soil. But his stride was no longer burdened as before. His old horse waited by the fence, breath rising in white clouds. Jonah stroked its mane, his eyes softened. He mounted, riding the familiar trail back home. Yet this morning the path felt different, not the road of loneliness, but the beginning of something new. From the plains came the crack of whips, the shouts of cowboys, the thunder of cattle. Jonah heard it all, the same sounds that once cut him with shame, the same eyes that had doubted him. This time he only nodded. He had walked through something they would never understand. The ranch appeared small, worn, its walls silvered by years of wind, its fences falling. For so long it had been nothing but a shell for a hollowed soul. Jonah dismounted, climbing the porch. Each board groaned beneath his boots, echoing the years of silence he had carried inside these walls. But today was different. He opened the door, set his battered hat upon the table, and laid a hand on the oil lamp long forgotten. The wick was brittle, the glass coated in dust. He drew a deep breath, struck a match, and touched flame to the wick. Light bloomed, warm golden. Shadows danced upon the wood. For the first time in years, the house was no longer dark. Jonah sat back in the chair, his gaze fixed on the glow. The flickering flame lit his face, softening the hard lines, bringing a glimmer to his weary eyes. And in that glow, memory returned, not as pain, but as presence. He saw his mother at the hearth, his wife smiling in this very room, all of it still alive in the warmth of the flame. Outside, the prairie wind still howled. Dust swept wild as it once had in the storms of his youth. But inside, the light held steady, unshaken. For the first time in many winters, the house felt alive, not another grave, but a home. Night fell, and in the distant town shadows spread. Yet on Jonah's ranch, a single oil lamp burned bright against the dark. Passers-by noticed. They whispered, "Old McGraw." Finally lit a lamp again. Some laughed, some shrugged. None of them knew what that light meant. Jonah sat at the window, eyes turned toward the deep woods. Somewhere out there in the dark walked a presence that remembered, a being that had honored his mother's grave, a keeper of memory. The lamp burned through the night, unyielding. It was his vow that he would not return to silence. As dawn neared, the wind slipped through the cracks, yet the flame held. Jonah leaned his head against the wall, tears glimmering, but in his eyes, faith renewed. He whispered, "Mother, I've found the light. I'll let it guide me for the rest of my days." The West was still a land of gunfire, stampedes, and suspicion. But Jonah no longer trembled before it. He had kindled a flame no man could put out. If you had lived in silence for years, would you dare to light a lamp again? Tell me in the comments. The night wind swept long across the western plains, carrying the taste of red dust and the distant howl of mountains. From Jonah McGraw's cabin spilled a soft golden glow, the oil lamp still burning steady after a long night. Jonah sat on the porch, back resting against a weathered post, his eyes fixed on the forest beyond. Moonlight poured silver across his face, carving each line of a life worn by loss. But this time, there was something new. His lips curved into a smile, the first in many years. In that smile lay a vow unspoken that memory and love never vanish. They only change their shape, returning in ways we least expect, sometimes as a crimson flower upon a grave, sometimes as a silent figure watching through the mist. In that moment, Jonah was no longer a lonely man. He was the keeper of a secret, the witness to a truth love does not die. Do you believe there are memories that never leave us? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know.